You already know why you did the last good deed you did. You're sure of it. Ask yourself right now the last time you helped someone, prayed a little longer, gave something away, and a reason surfaces instantly. Clean, ready-made, for Allah. Case closed. Except it isn't. And the speed with which that answer arrived should worry you more than a moment of doubt ever would. Because niyyah, the thing you've been taught, means intention. The thing you whisper before prayer or fasting like a verbal permission slip was never meant to be something you can produce on demand and trust completely. It was never a sentence you say. It is the entire architecture underneath every action you will ever take, built from layers you do not have full access to. Examined by a judge who reads structure, not statements. You think you know why you do what you do. By the end of this, you will understand exactly how much of that you don't, and why that gap is not a flaw in you. That's the whole point. Here is the simple version you were probably taught, likely before you were old enough to question it. Niyyah is the sentence you say in your heart, or under your breath, right before you begin an act of worship. I intend to fast tomorrow for the sake of Allah. I intend to pray 4 units of dur. Say the sentence, mean it in the moment, and the box is checked. Niyyah handled. Move on to the deed itself. That version isn't wrong so much as dangerously small, the way calling the ocean water isn't wrong, only catastrophically incomplete. Niyyah is not a sentence produced at the starting line. It is the entire direction your inner self was already facing before you ever opened your mouth to name it. The verbal formula, where scholars even permit it, is a courtesy to the tongue, a way of helping a scattered mind briefly align with something that was either already true underneath or wasn't, regardless of what got said out loud. You cannot manufacture sincerity by announcing it, any more than you can manufacture love by saying the word. The word can accompany reality. It cannot substitute for it. This is why the most quoted hadith in the entire tradition, the one that opens Sahih Bukhari, the one generations of scholars, including Imam al-Shafi'i, said carries within it a third of all religious knowledge, does not say actions are judged by what you announce. It says actions are by intentions, that each person will only get what they intended, not what they claimed, not what they hoped was true about themselves. What was actually, structurally there, that single distinction announced versus actual, is the crack this entire video is going to widen until you can see straight through it. Picture 2 men standing side by side at the mosque, each placing an identical amount of money into the same collection box, on the same day, with the same visible posture, the same unremarkable expression. To every camera, every witness, every record keeper on earth, these are the same action, interchangeable, statistically equal. They are not remotely the same event. One man's charity is casting the shadow of a heart that has in that moment genuinely forgotten itself, money leaving his hand the way water leaves a cup that is simply full. No thought of who's watching, no inventory being kept. The other man's charity, identical in every visible dimension, is casting the shadow of something else entirely. An image being built, a reputation being fed, an audience real or imagined being performed for. Same shadow, 2 entirely different objects casting it. This is the first paradox Niyyah forces on you. The deed is never the thing being judged. The deed is only ever the shadow. Niyyah is the object standing in the light, the actual shape determining what falls on the ground, and you can spend a lifetime studying shadows, comparing their length and their darkness and their edges, and never once see the object that produced them. Because the object doesn't stand where the light can reach your eyes. It stands inside you, in a place you don't have unobstructed access to, which means the deed you're proudest of and the deed you're most ashamed of could, in principle, be casting from objects far closer to each other than you'd like to admit, and the deed you dismissed as small could be casting from something enormous. The visible record and the actual record are not the same ledger. You have only ever been able to read one of them. Here is where it gets uncomfortable, because so far this has sounded like a problem other people have: the performer, the show-off, the man buying his reputation with charity. Surely you can tell the difference in your own case. Surely, when you look inward, you can see your own object clearly enough. You can't, not fully. And this isn't spiritual pessimism, it's simply how the self is built. The mind that generates your intentions is the same mind tasked with reporting on them to you, and a system cannot fully audit itself using only its own internal readout. Modern psychology has vocabulary for this motivated reasoning, self-serving bias, the mind's well-documented tendency to construct the most flattering available story and then experience that story as simple, obvious fact rather than as a construction at all. You do not experience your intentions as chosen. You experience them as given, as self-evidently true, which is exactly the disguise a corrupted intention would need to survive undetected. This is the mechanism the Quran and Hadith describe with far more precision than modern psychology has managed. Niyyah is not something you report on. It's something you are witnessed in by a judge who does not need your internal readout at all, because he built the system doing the reporting. There is a hadith, one of the starkest in the entire tradition, describing the first 3 people brought to account on the Day of Judgment, not the obviously wicked. A scholar who taught and recited the Quran beautifully, a man who fought and was killed in battle, a wealthy man who gave generously to every cause in front of him. By every visible measure, 3 of the most admirable lives imaginable, and each one, in turn, is told the same devastating sentence. You did this, so it would be said of you, and it was said. Now there is nothing left for you to collect. Their own record, read back to them, becomes the proof against them, and they are turned away before anyone less accomplished is even called forward. That hadith is not describing hypocrites who knew they were performing. It's describing people who, as far as their own conscious minds could tell, believed they were sincere and were still wrong about themselves at the one level that mattered. If that is possible for a martyr, a scholar, and a philanthropist, the confidence you felt about your own last good deed was never as reliable a witness as it felt like in the moment. If Niyyah were only a filter, a way of sorting good deeds from ruined ones, it would already be significant. But the tradition scales it into something closer to a law governing reward itself. And this is where it stops being merely psychological and becomes structural. There's an authentic hadith, among the most frequently taught in the tradition, describing how Allah records deeds before they even happen. A person who merely intends to do something good and never gets the chance to act on it still has one complete good deed written for him in full, not as a consolation prize. And if he does go on to perform it, that single deed is no longer recorded as one. It multiplies outward, 10 times over, then further, up to 700 times or more, the ceiling left deliberately open rather than fixed. Read what that structure implies. The intention alone is sufficient to generate a complete unit of reward. The physical action, when it follows, does not create value from nothing. It activates a multiplier on value that was already present the moment the niyyah formed. Niyyah is not the paperwork attached to the deed. It is closer to the ignition than the vehicle, the seed rather than the harvest, present and already counted before a single visible thing has occurred. The scale tips only one direction when the deed stays locked inside the niyyah that produced it. Cross into action, and the multiplier for good or harm switches on. You are, in the most literal sense the tradition offers, living inside an economy where the invisible object outweighs the visible shadow every time the two are weighed against each other. Once you accept that niyyah outweighs the deed, 3 increasingly uncomfortable paradoxes open in sequence: personal, then relational, then something closer to ontological. The personal paradox first. The more certain you feel that your intention is pure, the more suspicious you should be of that certainty. Not because doubt is a virtue in itself, but because settled self-satisfaction about your own sincerity is precisely the texture ujb, the quiet, self-congratulating pride the tradition treats as one of the most concealed diseases of the heart takes on when it wants to go unnoticed. The scholars quoted most often warning others about riyah, showing off, are frequently the same scholars recorded weeping over the state of their own intentions late into their lives. Confidence about your own sincerity is not evidence of sincerity. Ongoing, unfinished self-suspicion is closer to the actual marker. The relational paradox follows directly. If certainty about your own purity is unreliable, and other people's approval is one of the loudest inputs corrupting your intention without your noticing, then concealment stops being modesty and becomes something closer to hygiene, a deliberate way of starving the corrupting input before it can take root. This is the logic behind the hadith, describing the 7 people Allah shades on a day with no other shade. Among them a man whose charity is so hidden that his own left hand, metaphorically, does not know what his right hand has spent. That is not a poetic flourish. It's a described mechanism. Remove the audience, and you remove one entire pathway your niyyah has for quietly rerouting itself toward performance without your permission. Then the paradox tightens into something ontological, and this is the one most people never reach. If your intentions are this vulnerable to self-deception, this porous to outside approval, this hard to audit from the inside, then even your sincerity, when it does show up genuinely, was never something you manufactured through sheer willpower. Ibn Atiyah opens Al-Hikam with almost exactly this warning, that leaning on your own deeds as proof of your own standing is exposed the instant a single lapse arrives, and your hope collapses along with it. Proof your trust was resting on the deed all along, not on the one who permitted it. A pure niyyah, when it happens, is not something you achieved. It's something given to you to have, the way breath is given rather than earned, and the appropriate response to being given something is not pride in possessing it, but gratitude, laced with the awareness that it could be withdrawn. The spiral that never completes there is a trapdoor underneath everything said so far, and if you've been paying close attention, you may have already started falling through it. The moment you try to examine your intention to make sure it's pure, that act of examining is itself an action, which means it too needs a niyyah. Now you're checking the intention behind your intention checking. Was that self-examination genuine humility, or a quieter, more sophisticated form of the same self-congratulation you were trying to catch? You can ask that question, and the asking generates a third layer requiring the same audit, then a fourth. This is not a design flaw you've stumbled onto by overthinking it. It's the actual shape of the problem. And classical scholars who wrote on sincerity were aware of the spiral long before modern language had a name for infinite regress. Al-Ghazali, in the book on intention, sincerity, and truthfulness within the Niyyah, treats total, self-certified purity of niyyah as functionally unreachable for anyone still inhabiting an ego capable of self-reference at all, because the very faculty doing the checking is the same faculty capable of being corrupted, and it can never fully certify its own cleanliness, using only itself as the instrument. Individual experience of this varies. Some report the spiral as a source of anxiety, checking and rechecking without relief, which is its own imbalance the tradition also warns against. Others find that a few honest turns of the spiral, done without demanding a final, closed answer, is enough to loosen the grip of self-satisfaction without collapsing into paralysis. The goal was never to win the audit. It was to notice, permanently, that the audit cannot be won by you alone, and to let that specific, repeated, humbling non-completion become a form of worship in itself, rather than a problem waiting for a clever enough person to finally solve. False and mechanical niyyah here is where people, having heard everything above, still manage to build a comfortable escape hatch out of it, because every real spiritual mechanism gets counterfeited eventually, and niyyah is no exception. The counterfeit shows up in 3 familiar disguises. The first is the formula reciter, the person who says the words of intention with technical precision before every act of worship, and treats the ritual utterance itself as the finished product, exactly the shallow version this video opened by demolishing. The second is the frozen intention holder, someone who sets a niyyah at the start of a long task, a year of study, a business venture, a marriage, and assumes it stays fixed there permanently, never checking whether the motive quietly drifted over months of accumulated habit and comfort, since scholars are clear that niyyah can and does shift mid-act and deserves periodic renewal rather than a single deposit. The third, and most dangerous, is the performer of humility, someone who has learned from content exactly like this to perform self-suspicion as its own spiritual credential, turning "I worry my niyyah isn't pure" into a more sophisticated version of the very showing off it claims to guard against. 3 markers distinguish the real thing from all 3 counterfeits. First, indifference that survives contact with an empty room. Does the deed still happen with the same energy when you're certain no one will ever know it occurred? Second, willingness to lose the deed's visible fruit if the recognition, the thanks, the reputation attached to the act evaporated tomorrow. Would you still have wanted to do it? Third, and hardest to fake, an unease that never fully resolves into self-satisfaction, not despair, but a ongoing humility that keeps returning to the question rather than filing it as answered. Formula, freeze, and performed humility all produce comfort. The real thing, almost without exception, does not. Allah purifies what you cannot sow. If you cannot fully audit your own niyyah, cannot outthink the spiral, cannot trust even your own certainty about your own sincerity, where does that leave you? Not, as it might sound, in despair. It leaves you exactly where the tradition has been quietly pointing since the first sentence of this video, toward asking for what you cannot produce yourself. This is the reversal underneath the whole mechanism. You were never expected to manufacture perfect ikhlas through sheer inner effort, the way you might master a skill through repetition. Sincerity, in the classical framing, is not primarily something you build. It's something you are given. And the appropriate response to that fact is not resignation, but a specific, repeated request, asking the one who reads the object behind the shadow to straighten what you cannot see well enough to straighten yourself. The practice, then, is small enough to start tonight and precise enough to matter. Before any deed you actually care about doing well, a prayer, a difficult conversation, an act of charity, even this video's premise, applied to your own next decision, pause for the length of a single breath and ask directly for the niyyah itself to be purified, not just the outcome to be blessed. Not let this go well. Closer to, let the reason underneath this be the one you would approve of, even the parts of the reason I cannot see. Say it before the deed begins, and if you notice partway through that the motive has drifted, say it again, mid-act, without treating the drift as disqualifying. Renewal, not perfection, is the actual standard here. Act as though your niyyah is entirely your responsibility. Examine it. Renew it. Refuse the formula and the freeze and the performed humility, because you will be asked about exactly this, and simultaneously know that the deepest layer of that same niyyah was never fully yours to secure alone, no matter how carefully you examine it, because whatever purity finally reaches you will be given, not earned. Responsible for a thing you cannot fully control. Surrender on a thing you're still required to labor over. That is not a contradiction the tradition failed to notice. It is the exact shape niyyah was built to have, a shadow you're accountable for, cast by an object you don't fully own. The next deed you do today, in the next hour, maybe in the next few minutes, already has a niyyah forming underneath it right now. Whether or not you've looked closely enough to see what it actually is, you have time to look. Not much.